I think people are starting to come in now, but I'm going to wait just a couple of seconds, minutes, see if that number keeps going up a little bit. But thank you all for coming to Professor Nunez Seixas' talk about, gotta hold it up higher, about his book, The Spanish Blue Division on the Eastern Front, 1941 to 1945, which was published earlier this year by University of Toronto Press. My name is Stephen Shapiro. I'm the acquiring editor, one of the acquiring editors here, and was the editor of this book. And I want to thank the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Monk School and the Joint Initiative for German and European Studies for agreeing to host this talk, and then for pivoting to making this talk into a webinar at the last moment when our guest unfortunately couldn't be with us in person. So really excited to have this. I am going to do really just two things before I hand over the floor. The first is to read a quick land acknowledgement for the university, which is pretty physically close to where I'm located right now. And the other thing is also to put a link to the book's webpage in the chat. You can purchase it from the University of Toronto University of Toronto Press website, but also from where all good books are sold. And because the German Studies Association kicks off tomorrow, and this is a book with much in the way of German studies, you can use the discount CONF 2022, CONF 2022, to get a 25% discount. So what would normally be $39.95 is $29.96 through the website. And that discount runs through the conference and for a while thereafter. But as I said, I wanted to first of all acknowledge the land in which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. To introduce Professor Nunez Seixas, I'm going to ask Professor Adrian Shubert, Professor Emeritus now of York University, and a scholar of modern Spanish history, who's going to say a few words about the book. Adrian? Oh, and I guess we'll say, as conventional with this, after our speakers have talked, we have an opportunity for questions and answers. You can drop questions in the Q&A, which means that all of the hosts will be able to see it. And if it's manageable, I should also be able to unmute people orally, but we'll see how that goes. Okay, sorry. Thank you. Adrian.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I've known Xosé Manuel Nunez Seixas for more than 20 years, and I'm thrilled to have the privilege of introducing him and his wonderful book to all of you. Xosé Manuel is professor of history at the University of Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, Spain, and he's taught at Santiago since 1992, shortly after completing his PhD at the European University Institute in Florence. And with the exception of the period from 2012 to 2017, when he was professor of history at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, he has taught at Santiago. He's also been visiting professor at many universities, the University of Rennes 2, Paris 7, Paris 10, Verona, City University of New York, Stanford, National University of Mar del Plata in Argentina, amongst others. In addition to his academic work, he's a frequent contributor to the Spanish media on questions of nationalism, the far right, and historical memory. And since 2018, he's been the vice president of the Council of Galician Culture, an independent institution charged with conserving and promoting and disseminating Galician culture, and also serves as director of its Archive of Galician Emigration. Xosé Manuel is one of Spain's foremost historians, and he's one of Europe's leading scholars of nationalism, especially sub-state nationalisms. He's a truly prodigious scholar whose work covers a startling range of topics. In addition to nationalism, these include immigration, fascism and political identities, history and memory in the 20th century, and the cultural history of war and violence. I'll mention just a few of his recent books. Volver a Stalingrado, El Frente Este en la Memoria Europea, which was actually published in Spain today. Book Sites of the Dictators, Memories of Authoritarian Europe, 1945 to 2020, published last year. And Suspiros de España, El Nacionalismo Español, 1808-2018, which won Spain's National Essay Prize in 2019. So let me now turn to the book we're presenting today, The Spanish Blue Division on the Eastern Front, 1941 to 1945, War, Occupation, and Memory. This is a revised version of the original Spanish edition published in 2016 under the title Camarada Invierno, Comrade Winter, Experiencia y Memoria de la División Azul, and which was also translated into German that year. And I want to congratulate Stephen and the UTP team for bringing it to us in English. The book tells the story of the some 47,000 Spaniards who fought along the Wehrmacht and other German allies on the Eastern Front. Many of them were fascist idealists, some were anti-communist military men, some were adventurers, others were forced into service. They came from a variety of social backgrounds, although university students and lawyers were particularly prominent. The book speaks to a number of different readerships. I am, as Stephen said, a historian of Spain, and I will approach it from that perspective. But I'm sure that those of you who are specialists on World War II or on Eastern Europe or on Germany or on other things will read the book differently, or at least focus on different aspects of it. So my first observation is the range of the research. The book is based on sources from public archives in Germany, Russia, and the United States, as well as in Spain. There are also unpublished memoirs and war diaries from private collections across Spain. And the primary research is backed up by an extensive bibliography of published material in a number of European languages. My next observation is it was striking for me as a historian of Spain to read about Spanish soldiers fighting in someone else's war. I think we're all familiar with the question of foreign intervention in the Spanish Civil War, which ended just a few months before the outbreak of World War II. Italians, Germans, and Portuguese on the side of the Francoists, Soviets, and tens of thousands of volunteers from more than 50 countries who served in the international brigades on the side of the Republic. A set of interventions, and on the part of the democratic powers, non-interventions that determined the outcome of that conflict. The Spaniards fought alongside the Wehrmacht in the Soviet Union is a much less familiar story, particularly outside of Spain. These soldiers were not, as Xosé Manoel tells us, a significant part of the German forces on the fronts where they served, nor were they particularly well regarded by German officers who had their prejudices about Spaniards, individually brave, but badly trained and suited to guerrilla warfare and small-scale operations, but not much else. They were, as he says, not undesirable soldiers, but they were not desired. Third, as a work of new military history, one that focuses on the experience of frontline soldiers, the book makes a significant contribution to renewing the historiography of the Spanish Civil War and its aftermath. Until very recently, the military history of the war has focused on military operations, and the broader literature on questions of politics and ideology. The book also brings important debates, such as those around the brutalization effects of war and of bystanders to atrocities, into the Spanish War. Connected to this is the book's transnational aspect. Until quite recently, historians of modern Spain have approached their subject in isolation, rather than as part of a broader European history. And to be fair, Europeanists who work on other countries too often ignore Spain altogether. What Blue Division veterans remembered about their experience on the Eastern Front was part of a transnational memory of that experience. But in their case, one that was conditioned by the existence of the Francoist dictatorship into the mid-1970s. And this brings me to my final observation, the book's emphasis on memory. I think this reflects the situation in Spain when the book was written, and one that continues today. Even though the national government and the governments of some autonomous regions began taking action in 2007, historical memory, how the state should remember the Civil War and the Franco regime, remains a hot topic. The current national government has been more daring, removing Franco's remains from the Valley of the Fallen in 2019 and passing a new law of democratic memory earlier this year. But the Spanish right continues to refuse to support such measures. The case of the Blue Division is much less significant than that, for example, of the many unmarked mass graves that litter the Spanish countryside, for example, but is another reflection of how problematic historical memory has been for democratic Spain. Even though the Franco regime, desperate to distance itself from its pro-Axis past after 1945, did not include the Blue Division in its ubiquitous memory politics, a diffuse positive memory did survive, and promoted in large part by the many memoirs and accounts that Xose Manoel draws on for the book. The shortcomings of the memory politics of the post-Franco democratic governments have allowed this positive memory to persist, even into our century. Now, this is, as I said, a very personal reading of a very rich book. These are the features that stand out to me, but I'm certain that many of you will find others that stand out as well. So, Stephen, that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. All right. Professor, you want to take it away? You want to, if you want to share your slides at this stage, you should be able to do so.
Okay. So, do you see the slides?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much, Adrian, for this very generous and introduction. And first of all, I would like to apologize for the fact that I cannot be in Toronto today, as it was my wish, yes, also to participate at Adrian Schubert's conference, or at the conference in honor of Adrian Schubert's. But I was a victim. Yesterday, I was a victim of Lufthansa shortcomings, and particularly of I don't know whether I could take it as an example of European decadence or German decadence, which is more or less the same, because I took 3 Lufthansa flights this summer, and in all 3 I had problems of concerning rescheduling of flights, canceling of flights, etc., etc. But yesterday I was particularly, let's say, it has particularly affected my personal schedule. Anyway, thanks to technology, thanks to the generosity and efficiency of the Center for European and Eurasian Studies, of the Munch School of Global Affairs, at least we can have this webinar. So I would like, first of all, to thank, I would also like to thank the Munch School of Global Affairs for hosting this seminar. Okay, and after listening to Adrian's presentation, I have the impression there's actually not much left to say from my part, although I've written the book. However, perhaps a first question could be that you all could address me why writing a new book about the Blue Division. Certainly there were a number of books available, even in English, on the history of the Blue Division, which focus on military aspects, on the operational history. This is not a book on the military operations where the Blue Division was involved. This is not a new book concerning the heroic deeds or of that unit or whatever, or other units. I intended to write a book from a different perspective. And this perspective was related to my personal interest, to my previous research interests, particularly cultural history, the history of representations, social history, and the history of warfare and violence, and the history of war, but not seen from the perspective, from a political or purely political perspective, but seeing regarded from a cultural angle. I mean, and focusing on the soldiers as protagonists, not on the high officers or on diplomacy, on the generals and military strategies, etc. So my first interest was to try to apply to put in practice a new approach to the history of the Blue Division. Certainly 47,000 soldiers, of which 42,000 returned to Spain, is just a drop in a drop of water in the sea. I mean, talking about the Eastern Front, we have to take into account that the invading forces comprise several million people, and obviously the bulk of this invading army was composed of German soldiers, but even compared to 200,000 Italians or 500,000 Hungarians or several 100,000 Romanians, the Spaniards shaped a very little unit. However, there was one of the units in Second World War which has produced the highest number of memoirs, of fictional accounts, or which has cultivated its memory, which is particularly evident even in Spain today. And there was also a legend, a kind of soft narrative of the Spanish soldiers in the East as good occupiers, as benevolent soldiers, as occupiers who were very different from the Germans, who behaved correctly towards the Russian people, who were not involved at all in the Holocaust, who didn't know anything about German brutal policies in the rear. And this has produced a huge number of memoirs, a huge number of accounts. And obviously the fact that Franco's dictatorship lasted until 1975 and even beyond also contributed to the fact that all these memoirs could be published without any restriction, contrary to what happens in other countries. And that the narrative of these memoirs continuously insisted on this pink legend and this pink narrative of the Blue Division as good soldiers, as good occupiers. So my first interest was to deconstruct this narrative, hence my emphasis on memory, but not only on memory, my emphasis on perceptions. I mean, how these Spanish soldiers saw the world, how they regarded Germany, how they saw Eastern Europe, how was the first encounter with real Jews, although many of them were more or less anti-Semitic oriented, but it was a kind of religious Catholic-based anti-Semitism, but no one of them had ever witnessed a real Jew. So what happened when they really met Jews in Eastern Poland, today's Belarus? How was their relationship with the allies, particularly with the Germans, with their allies or their brothers in arms? Or particularly how did they really behave towards Russian civilians I mean, this is not the place to explain you the contents of the book and to tell you about the military operations or the front sectors where the Blue Division was involved. First Novgorod, then the siege of Leningrad. However, I think it is interesting to see or to perceive, to understand that Spanish soldiers were deployed at very poor regions, in very poor areas of the Russian countryside. And what they saw seemed to confirm their stereotypes about what communism was, about what communism had brought with it. I mean, poverty, misery, etc. They consider that the Russians were nice people, were innocent people, were victims of the Soviet regime, but at the same time, they also consider that the Russians, in a way, deserve their fate. I mean, particularly Russian peasants, because they saw them from a perspective which I would label as cultural racism. I mean, they didn't consider the Russians to be genetically inferior as a biological race, but they considered them to be culturally inferior, and they consider that the Russians actually were a kind of infant people, a kind of childish people, if you want, which was underdeveloped in its way towards civilization. However, unlike most German soldiers, unlike many German soldiers, and even Hungarian soldiers, they consider that Russia could be saved, that Russia could be, in a way, brought back to European civilization by re-Christianizing the Russian people, by coming back to religion. Anyway, this narrative, what I say, is not particularly different from what many authors dealing with the German soldiers or with Italian soldiers have already affirmed. There were, particularly among Catholic German soldiers, a different worldview and a different perception of the enemy, or at least partly. What I say was, in some, particularly in Spanish military history, was not always welcome, because it tended to nuance and tended to give a new color to what had been considered to be a Spanish exception in the war of extermination. This discourse, this narrative, was not originally Spanish. It has to be said that in my last book, coming back to Volver Stalingrado, I mean, about the memory of the Eastern Front in Europe, I've observed striking parallels, striking parallelisms, striking similarities between Italian and Spanish post-war narratives on the Eastern Front. I mean, the good Italian and the good Spanish occupier, the good behavior towards the locals, particularly towards the Russians, the idea that Spaniards were victims not only of the Soviets, but also they were victims of the Germans, because the Germans tended to look at them with some disdain, tended to depict the Spaniards as inferior soldiers, as good guerrilla fighters, as good, but as someone or as soldiers who were not really prepared for modern warfare. Well, saying that, I think Adrian has already pointed out some of the characteristics of my book. Actually, I tried to write a transnational book which could be read and understood by an audience which was not exclusively or mostly interested in Spanish history. I tried to look for the intersections and the transnational aspects, also aspects regarding cultural transfer between Spanish fascism and German National Socialism, but also I addressed the question of to what extent there was an image of the Russians before the before the outbreak of Second World War, of the German-Soviet War. And I also try to emphasize similarities and differences with German soldiers, particularly. I mean, showing you a picture which I very much like. For a number of reasons, it was not possible to use it for the cover, but I think it's one of the best photographs of Second World War I've ever seen. And you see Spanish and German soldiers short after a fight in Miasno Ibo. It was January 1942. And as you see in this picture, it is completely impossible to differentiate between German and Spanish soldiers. They are all dirty, they are all tired, they are exhausted, but they are happy to survive. They are happy to have survived. And I think this picture entails many of the meanings and many of the aspects I wanted to explain in my book. But obviously the perception of Russian civilians and the perception or the Spanish perception of Russian civil populations on the one hand, the relations with the locals, but also Russian perceptions of the Spaniards. And this is something which is new in the English edition of the book, because I had access to some more Russian sources, for those acquainted with Russian history among in the audience perhaps not know about the problems of having access to some military sources in Russian archives. I was fortunate enough to get access to some of them, and particularly to get access to the works by some local Russian historians such as Boris Kovalev and others, who have extensively dealt with NKVD reports, with Soviet intelligence reports about Spanish behavior and how Spanish treated civilians. Many of these photographs actually reproduce this pink legend. I mean, Spanish soldiers dancing with Russian women, or a Russian woman who is carrying the gun of a Spanish soldier who is exhausted after the Battle of Krasnivor, etc. Or even these pictures, the one below is, I mean, was taken by a Galician sergeant who was a very good photographer, and who portrayed a column of Soviet prisoners being guarded by some German soldiers. So my interest was to see or to look at the Blue Division from different perspectives. Obviously, why I'm interested in Spanish history, obviously, but also interested in German history for a number of reasons. I am very linked to German historiography. I have a great interest in German history, and the Blue Division offer me also a window, if you want, to look at these intersections and interactions, or at least transfers. But I was also increasingly fascinated by Russian or Soviet history, and I just apologize for the fact that my knowledge of Russian is extremely limited. When I was in the Novgorod region 215, I had the chance to interview some Russian civilians, for instance, here in Posad, which was the place where very important fights took place between German, Spanish, and Soviet soldiers, and these women already still remember the Spanish soldiers, and it was a very nice experience. Obviously, I was also concerned with contrasting contemporary images of the Russians, or of communism, in brackets, and post-war views, post-war narratives, or post-war memories of the Spanish experience on the Eastern Front. If you see these propaganda images and even these drawings drawn by a very popular Spanish cartoonist, King Joaquin Alba, who worked for the Spanish Falange's fascist newspaper, Arriba, you see how the picture was. I mean, this was the Soviet Union. These were the Soviet soldiers according to his depiction. However, if you look at cartoons, even the cartoons of the Trench Journal, I mean, you see this kind of nice view of paternalistic image, not only of Russian peasants with long bards, etc., but also of Soviet soldiers, and even this idea of Spaniards, you know, dealing or trying to deal with a male peasant about the price of a cow. Everything has its reverse side. I mean, the Spaniards were not involved in the Holocaust actively, but they knew some faces. They saw the preceding stages of the Holocaust in Eastern Poland between September and October 1941, and then they also witnessed some, let's say, some acts of violence and some brutal reprisals of Germans against Jews in Vilnius and Riga, because there were Spanish hospitals in these cities. But the way they remember the Holocaust was very peculiar. I mean, we didn't know anything about it. It was a thing of the Germans. It was not that important. They always emphasize the fact that Spaniards, for instance, in Grodno or in Vilnius, 1941, they try to pick up Jewish women. If you see, for instance, this cartoon, one of the very few depictions of Jews of Eastern European Jews in Spanish sources and Spanish veterans journals after 1945, you see how it is vandalized. I mean, the soldier says a Jewish woman with yellow star on her back. I say, I don't understand why it is banned. Perhaps because it is poisoned. I mean, the importance, obviously, the joke is very bad. The joke is not very, but the idea is, I don't understand, the Spanish soldiers doesn't understand why Germans don't like Jewish women, which is a way to banalize what really happened. I mean, the soldier seems to ignore, or who draw this cartoon seem to ignore, that this Jewish woman from Grodno ended up, or probably ended up in Treblinka a few months later. So this is a book about interaction. This is a book about new military history. This is a book about perceptions of the enemy, perceptions of civilians, mutual perceptions of soldiers who fight in a distant land. And it's also, as I said, as Adrian affirmed, it is a book about memory. And this is my last photograph, which shows Spanish corner of the German War Cemetery in Pankopka, which is still maintained by Spanish Ministry of Defense. And just to highlight the contrast with the Spanish present-day memory politics until very recently, these soldiers, these dead men who were Spanish fallen soldiers in Russia, were object of the Spanish politics of memory. They still paid the German government, particularly an agency of the German government, for exhumating corpses of Spanish soldiers and for and to re-inhumate them in these cemeteries, which this happened since 1995, since the last socialist cabinet presided over by Felipe González, and continues to happen today while exhumating the corpses of victims of Franco's repression still causes a lot of unrest and negative reactions on the side of the Spanish right. So obviously there's much more to say. I would like to extend myself on this topic, but these are some of the traces of the memory of the Blue Division today. I mean, you can see it in some cemeteries. This happened in 1961. This man with who makes the fascist salute, who was a town councillor from the back city of Vitoria. This was obviously unthinkable in Italy or Western Europe at that time. This is the return of the last Spanish prisoners in the Soviet Union. They were received not by crowds actually, but some demonstrations. And I particularly like this picture because you see this is like the Francoist regime in a nutshell. I mean, you see the church, you see war veterans, you see the military who are welcoming the so-called heroes from Russia. And the idea that Spaniards were, I mean, the official narrative promoted by the Franco regime, and which was later also advocated by the Spanish Veterans Associations, emphasized the fact that they were fighting against the Soviets, not against the Russian people. They also emphasized the fact, or they emphasized the perception or the idea that they were fighting in Russia alongside the Germans, but not for Nazi Germany. However, this is a picture from the early 1950s, and you see how 7 Eastern Front veterans in a very small town close to Barcelona, Calella, gathered to commemorate their departure to the Eastern Front, and you see that they all are proud of wearing Nazi symbols, including Nazi flag. Obviously, when I put this picture in my book, many representatives of the Spanish far right accused me of using a non-representative image, a non-representative picture. I'm not saying that every Spanish veteran harbored or was sympathies for Nazi Germany, but many of them were much more sympathetic than they were ready to acknowledge on public sphere. So it also tells us a lot about the character of the Franco regime, about the survival of the Franco regime, and particularly about the survival of some elements that still in the 50s, the 60s, and 70s reminded that the period of the interwar period, and particularly that many sympathies towards Nazi Germany were still alive. So thank you very much. It was my short comment, perhaps a little bit not very structured, but as I said, I think it made no sense to make here a summary of the book, but rather to illustrate some aspects.
All right, thank you very much. So we have plenty of time for questions if people have them. So as I think I mentioned, we have a Q&A box, which everyone has access to. We also have a hand raise and allow to talk feature. So if you would prefer to do that, I think I can make that work. And if people want to inwardly digest and think about questions to pose. I mean, Adrian, you've had as much time as you wanted, but I don't know if there's anything you want to ask. Otherwise, I can step in with a question or two.
Well, I'll let you go first, Stephen. I've had my time.
Okay. And maybe this is inside baseball, maybe it's not, because the book was published in German shortly after it was published in Spanish, and then I know you revised again for the English edition. Some of that is new material that you simply didn't have. Some of it is writing for an English audience, but rather than just sort of ask the question like, what other than explain Spanish history to Anglophones, the difference between how you wrote for the German edition and the English, and maybe extending on beyond that, does the Blue Division have any traction in German memory politics? Does it fit somewhere into how Germans, scholars or the general public, remember the Eastern Front?
Well, this is a very interesting question. Actually, most German colleagues, the first time I attended a conference of German military historians, which was something like 2003, 2004, I remember it was in Hamburg. I was extremely happy and extremely excited because I had been invited, or my proposal had been accepted by the most important German military history association, which makes new military history, not traditional military history. And it was the first time I actually switched sides. I mean, it was not the clique of nationalist historians. It was a different audience. I had to put the case or to explain the case to a different audience. I was quite struck by the fact that everyone knew about the existence of the Blue Division, but very few knew about the details. Very few how many they were, whether they were fascists or not, whether they were volunteers or not. Many believe there was like a Waffen-SS legion or division, which was not exactly. Many believe that Franco had been belligerent against the Soviet Union, which was not the case. But I also was struck by the fact that everyone believed, well, unlike the Italians, they were good soldiers. This is, I mean, this pink legend that, I mean, Spaniards were chaotic. Spaniards were not very good, not very good members of the military. They were not disciplined, etc., etc. However, they were extremely brave, unlike the Italians or the Hungarians. And these myths were very still present. And I think that the publication of my book in German has contributed to revise these myths and to particularly put the Blue Division within framework, or to place the history of the Blue Division within the framework of the Eastern Front, of the new military history of the Eastern Front, and to better compare Germans with Spaniards, with Italians, etc. And well, in this respect, reviews were quite positive. There's like a couple of details, but they all acknowledge, well, here, I mean, this guy makes a kind of military history that we understand. And obviously, a biggest challenge was to present this for an international audience in English, not only Anglo-American and the like audience, but also Russian audience. I mean, people interested in the history of the Soviet Union, in the history of the Red Army, or in the history of the Soviet war effort. And this was my main concern, to try to catch up, to be in this respect, and to offer them a contribution to the history of the relations between the occupying forces and the civilians, and hence also my increasing interest in having access and collecting Russian sources. Obviously, this is still a hard work, and I hope that to be able to get access to some more sources in the future, in the near future. However, when I compare my results, my previous results, with the first results produced, or rather with the contributions published by some Russian historians like Kovalev and others, I realized that our interpretations and our views were not that different. I mean, that their sources were confirming more or less what my sources stated. But anyway, as I said, as Adrian also explained, I tried not to write a book on exclusively Spanish history. I was particularly fascinated by the fact that this is a part of a global history of the Second World War and of the Soviet-German War, which we know has a peculiarity, a special place within the Second World War, not least because it offered Germany the chance, the possibility of implementing the Holocaust.
No, I mean, I think from my perspective, it was really exciting to see the way you were able to balance those competing audiences, and I think hopefully everyone can take a lot away, both in what they were looking for answers on, and also in the areas which they didn't realize there were interesting questions. So we've got some more questions in the Q&A. Adrian, did you have a chance to look at those? And maybe
Sure. Okay, so first question from Harold Armstrong. What was the role of the German SS in recruitment for the Blue Division? And then about post-war pension entitlements for volunteers.
So the German SS had no function at all in recruiting Spanish volunteers for the Blue Division, because the Blue Division had a special status within the German Wehrmacht, within the German regular forces. It was not a part of the SS, has never been a part of the SS. The peculiarity was that it was a unit which had Spanish commanders. Its commander-in-chief was also Spanish general, first Muñoz Grandes. And particularly, and the most striking peculiarity is that the Spanish division was subject to its own code of military justice. The Spanish soldiers were not subject to German military justice, which created a lot of problems at the front line, because when Spanish soldiers committed excesses or some acts of brutality, they couldn't be court-martialed by German authorities, and so by German military tribunals. So the Germans always complain and blame the Spanish officers of being too tolerant, etc. Of course, it has to be read from a different perspective. The German officers were always ready to accuse the Spaniards of committing crimes and abuses against the Russian population, and particularly of let's say of uncontrolled looting. While German looting existed, but was much more organized. And so the Waffen-SS, or the German SS, had only a minor role in recruiting some Spanish volunteers, around 200 or 300, after the Spanish Blue Division was withdrawn from the Eastern Front in February, March 1944. Then some Spanish fanatics were recruited by the German Foreign Ministry and by the German Wehrmacht, and some Spanish civil workers in Germany were also attracted by the Waffen-SS. But there were just 2 companies and some platoons within German Waffen-SS divisions, particularly within the Wallonian Waffen-SS division between October, November 44 and April 45. As regarding the second question, if I understood it correctly, it was whether Spanish veterans were entitled to receive payments, pensions from the German government, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was in point form, and it literally says all Spanish volunteers post-war pension retirement. I don't know if Harold Armstrong would like to type in perhaps to elaborate on that.
Yeah, well, Obviously, all Spanish soldiers after of the Blue Division, after they came back to Spain, they were recognized, particularly military officers. They were recognized their merits. There is a generation of Spanish officers who actually jumped upwards and promoted quite much more faster than those who didn't go to Russia. And so in the Spanish transition, there were a lot of Spanish commanders and generals who had been active, had been deployed in Russia in the 1940s. Spanish soldiers, Spanish volunteers were not entitled to receive pensions from the German government unless they were injured or they were, how to say, they had disabled soldiers. It was the object of a special agreement between the Spanish government and the German federal government in the early 1960s. And some 4,000 Spanish war veterans who had or who were recognized some degree of disability received pensions from the German government. And some continue to receive them today, although most Spanish war veterans are over 95.
Okay, a question from Murray Tatel. Franco himself refused to hand over the 40,000 East European Jews who sheltered in Spain during the war, and himself had some Jewish ancestry. To what extent did he personally have control over these soldiers once they were in Russia? Could he have insisted they not participate in the roundup of Jews, or were things out of his hands?
Well, first of all, I don't really think the story about the Jewish ancestry of Franco, I think is a tale, is a fairy tale, has not been proved at all, and I don't really think it's much relevant. Whether perhaps, I mean, as you know, most Spaniards may have some Jewish ancestors because of the forced conversion of Jews in the late 15th century. Well, it may happen, but it played no role at all in Spanish politics, even the Spanish public debate in the early 1940s. So I don't really think Franco himself was especially committed to the fate of the Jews. Certainly, Spain did not deliver, to the Germans, the Jews who were crossing Spanish territory to go to Lisbon or to trying to go to the Americas. But the Spanish government under Franco also refused to accept many Jews, particularly those who were refugees in the southern France. So it was thanks to the activity, the independent activity, and on the initiative, on the private initiative of some Spanish consuls, and particularly the Spanish ambassador in Hungary, that some Jews were given Spanish passports and were saved from the fate that awaited most Jews in Hungary after 1944. So, second, where Franco had control of Spanish soldiers on the Eastern Front, absolutely. I mean, from the distance, Franco even was aware of the fact that some of the generals and the first commander-in-chief of the Blue Division was known for his pro-fascist stance, Muñoz Grandes. So Franco decided to call him to Madrid and to replace him with a more professional and less fascist general, who was Esteban Infantes. But Franco didn't give any direct orders to protect or not protect Jews, or not to participate in roundups, for a simple reason. When the Spaniards arrived in the Novgorod region and afterwards in the Leningrad region, there were no Jews left. They had all been killed by Einsatzgruppe A in September, between August and September 1941. This was a region with very few Jews. I mean, very few Jews were settled in that region before. Most of them had escaped to the Soviet area, Soviet-controlled regions, and those who left had been already killed by Germans. So Spaniards had no possibility of encountering Jews, unlike Hungarians, unlike Italians, for instance. The only encounters were on the foot march, the march on foot from East Prussia to Vitebsk through former Eastern Poland between August, September, at the beginning of October 1941. And there, particularly at some cities, the Spaniards could meet a lot of Jews. And they didn't understand what was going on. They didn't like the Jews. Most of them didn't like the Jews as an abstract category, but they didn't approve, or most of them didn't approve what the Germans were doing. I mean, they couldn't witness the final destination, the final destiny, or the final fate of those Jews. It was still before the adoption of the so-called final solution in January 42. But some of them could regard what happened. But I have to say that in many diaries, in many memoirs, the Jewish issue is simply not mentioned. I mean, there are even photographs. Although we know, I mean, I was able to collect some accounts from Jewish survivors which underline the fact that the Spaniards behaved in a different way. They were humans. You know, as a late David Bankier, who was a director of research at Yad Vashem in Israel, whom I invited once many years ago to come over to Galicia for a summer school, I could explain us the Holocaust in a very didactic way, I mean, to my students. He also mentioned to me, you know, it was very easy to be more human than the Germans at that time. So if you always compare yourself with the Germans, obviously you are always the winner. But perhaps you could put the question, what could you have done to save Jews, to save more people? Because there are very, just a couple of examples of possible saviors of Jewish people in the case of the Blue Division, which had not already been confirmed. I mean, even these Spanish soldiers didn't receive the title of righteous among the nations from Yad Vashem. So from this perspective, it is very easy to say, well, Spaniards were not anti-Semitic, the Spaniards behaved correctly, but Spaniards simply met or had morally chances to meet Jews at the front line and very few chances to meet Jews at the rear.
Okay, we have one more from Jose Enrique Montero Camacho, and it's more a comment than a question. It's regarding Spanish memory politics. So in Spain, we had a process called the transition after Franco's death, where most of the political parties represented in parliament, including communist and socialist parties, decided to turn the Civil War page and look to the future. The fathers of the Constitution voted in 1978 included 2 members of the Communist Party and more from the Socialist Party. Some people, including myself, don't see why it's appropriate now to have a very sectarian law like the one I mentioned, reopening a process that was closed.
What you call a sectarian law, I think, is a right law. It's simply to recover the memory of the vanquished and to entitle people who were not able to mourn their relatives simply to have the possibility of having a place to mourn their relatives. So I'm afraid we have a different view of this, but I think the democratic quality of of a country, of a political community, also resides in the fact that it's able to produce a democratic memory. This democratic memory must be inclusive, this democratic memory must be counterbalanced, or must be balanced, of course, and must be, in a way, the contents of this memory has to be elaborated, has to be performed by professionals. I don't really think this is a sectarian memory. These are sectarian memory politics. On the contrary, there are many limitations to this. I mean, obviously, if you consider that Germany or all the countries of France are sectarian countries because they condemn fascism and they also contemplate, I mean, the recognition of the victims of dictatorial regimes. Well, then I'm afraid we cannot agree upon a solution.
Okay, that's all in the Q&A box, Stephen.
Yeah. So if people maybe we have time if people want it, but so give maybe a last chance for people to put in questions. And I will fill that by asking Professor Nunez Seixas what you're working on now. I think Adrian alluded to a new book that has just come out in Spanish. So if you want to mention that, show us that. Oh, it's blurred because you're blurred. It's we can see about half of it. No, it's because you have your screen. No, your background blur.
Oh.
It decides that it needs to filter that out like your background. So never mind. But
well,
so.
no, because I'm very proud of the cover of this book. I show you if I have the. Okay, you see the cover of the book on the left, which are Soviet soldiers at the memorial of the Treptower Park in East Berlin, 1952. I mean, you recognize this famous sculpture representing a Soviet liberator with a German, it's not a boy, with a German girl and with a sword. And this picture was taken by a Finnish photographer who worked for the Finnish government, and this can be downloaded free of rights from the site of the Finnish Cultural Heritage Agency. Well, this book is about the memory. It is about comparing memories of the Eastern Front in all of Europe, from Spain and Italy to Russia. I mean, to Soviet Union first, and then to Russia, the Soviet successor republics, particularly the Baltics, Ukraine, which is sadly now a very present topic in our screens, and Finland, and obviously the two Germanys. I mean, how the memory of the Eastern Front, to what extent did the Eastern Front and the Soviet-German War become a memory site, the European memory site, or to what extent did the different policies of memory, which were implemented by diverse countries across Europe, divergent or more or less convergent. Obviously, there are strike differences between Germany on the one hand, the two Germanies on the one hand, and the Soviet Union on the other hand. Finland is the only defeated country in the Second War, in the German-Soviet War, which still claims to, which still cultivates a positive memory and heroic memory of its soldiers, because in the Finnish view, the Finnish soldiers were not fighting against the Soviet Union, but just to recover territories which had been lost in the Winter War. There's a chapter devoted, obviously, to the Soviet Union and then Russia, and then you see the striking similarities, the striking continuities between Khrushchev and Brezhnev's politics of memory on the Soviet-German War and present-day politics of memory which are implemented by the Putin government. And there's just one element which is absent, which is Stalin. I mean, Stalin is completely out, almost completely out of the picture. And well, I also wrote a chapter on the Baltic republics and Ukraine. I mean, I have to say that in March this year, I had to rewrite and extend, for obvious reasons, the chapter on Ukraine. And to me, it was, I mean, on the one hand, Finland was a discovery. And on the other hand, I went deeper into the Italian memories of the Second World War, which were quite similar to the Spaniards, but with some differences as well. So, the book just came out today. I mean, it's now available in bookshops, Amazon, etc. And I hope to be able to produce perhaps a German version will be published in the near future, and who knows, perhaps an English version as well. But first, it had to be tested against the knowledge of the knowledge of very different experts on memory politics, because there is a lot of studies have been written about Russian memory politics, about Ukrainian memory politics, about German memory politics, and many of them deal with, for instance, Stalingrad in German memory, or the myth of Stalin, or whatever. However, I've tried to make a kind of overview, not only an overview, a particular transnational view of how, to what extent are they similar, to what extent are they different. And, well, I have to say this is a kind of byproduct of my book on the Blue Division, where I decided, well, the memory of the Eastern Front could be a book, and now it became a book. It was awarded an essay prize last year, which has the name of Walter Benjamin, which is obviously a great honor for me.
It looks fantastic. Look forward to seeing more about that. I think we should wrap up there. Thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry you weren't able to join us in person in Toronto, but it's been fantastic that have everyone available like this. Thank you as well to the audience and everyone for joining us, and to Professor Shubert for your comments and following up on the Q&A, and to our hosts at Sarah's and the Monk School for making all of this possible. And I think that's pretty much it. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good afternoon, evening, morning, depending on time zone.
Well, here is, as you see, it's the evening. Yes. Now.
Maybe we have someone, it's afternoon here, but maybe we have someone from the West Coast or from Asia.
We already had sunset. Anyway, I wish you a good afternoon, and I will see Adrian again. I will see Adrian in 2 days again. Mm-hmm. So, and have a good, and thank you very much for your acceptance of the manuscript, for the proposal. As I already told you, and also told Adrian, I'm very happy with the English edition.
It's been a great pleasure.
I think the book is perfect. I mean, and I was unable to find any, any typos so far.
So far, give it time.
Yeah, I know typos.
But yes, let's hope.
Typos are unavoidable.
A typo-free book.
All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.